Hey everyone, welcome to today's video. Today we will be continuing our study on the leopard-like beast of Revelation 13. In our last video we identified this beast as the papacy, the system over which the Pope of Rome heads. We saw that it fulfilled all of the criteria mentioned in chapter 13, and so if you haven't seen that video, I invite you to check it out. I will leave a link in the description below, as today we will be continuing from where we left off. There are a number of things that we didn't have opportunity to address from the chapter, and so in this video we want to look further into how the Bible describes this beast. And so Revelation 13 reads, "And I stood upon the sand of the sea, and saw a beast rise up out of the sea. And the beast which I saw was like unto a leopard, and his feet were as the feet of a bear, and his mouth as the mouth of a lion. And the dragon gave him his power and seat and great authority." Here the beast is described, and we didn't mention this before, but in verse 2 we learn that the beast of Revelation 13 is actually an amalgamation of a number of different beasts. It has the mouth of a lion, the feet of a bear, the body of a leopard, and then its power and authority was given it by the dragon. Now that's very interesting. So 4 distinct beasts are mentioned, 4 being a very interesting number, and we will hear it repeated as we continue on. But 4 distinct beasts are mentioned, its body comprising of 3 of these beasts, and the 4th, that is the dragon, gives it its power, its seat, and great authority. So we want to understand what these things mean, and to do so we have to look into the book of Daniel, where these beasts were first mentioned, and understand what is represented by each of them. Keeping in mind that the papacy, the beast of Revelation 13, is an amalgamation of these different beasts. So in Daniel chapter 7 and verse 2, we read of a vision that Daniel has, and as we continue on, it will become very clear that the imagery used in Revelation 13 is directly taken from this chapter. In verse 3, we see 4 beasts coming up out of the sea, the same language seen in Revelation 13. These beasts are then described. The first, in verse 4, was a lion with eagle's wings. In verse 5, the second was said to be a bear. And in verse 6, the third is said to be a leopard. Again, the same 3 beasts we read of in Revelation 13. Lastly, a 4th beast is mentioned in verse 7. No name was given to it. The only description we have is that it was dreadful and terrible. But there's evidence to show that it was in fact a dragon. But that's something we'll look at more in our next video. For now, what I want to be appreciated is the fact that Daniel 7 and Revelation 13 are undeniably related, as the exact imagery is used and the beasts are described in similar fashion. So in this chapter we have 4 beasts, as we have said. In verse 17 and verse 23, we are told that these 4 beasts represent 4 distinct kingdoms. That being the case, the beast of Revelation 13 then, being an amalgamation of these beasts, means that it is an amalgamation of these specific kingdoms, the specific body parts being indicative of the unique attributes taken from its respective kingdom. But we'd return to this point in a moment. Something that's very important to understand though is that while these 4 beasts denote 4 kingdoms, these kingdoms do not all rule simultaneously, but instead successively, one following the other. Meaning the kingdom represented by the lion ruled first, it is then followed by the second kingdom denoted by a bear, and so forth. This idea of successive kingdoms is seen more explicitly in the 2nd chapter of Daniel, with chapter 7 serving as a further development of what was introduced in chapter 2. So let's look at chapter 2 briefly. In this chapter we have the mysterious dream of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. And in this dream he saw a great image divided into 4 primary metals. We are told in verse 32 that the head of this image was of gold, its breasts and arms of silver, its belly and thighs of brass, its legs of iron, and finally in the feet we have the addition of clay to the iron. And so this is what the image looks like. From verse 36 onward, this symbolism is then explained. We learn that the aforementioned metals represent kingdoms that follow each other successively. In verse 37 and verse 38, we are told that the head of gold represented the kingdom of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar being king at that time. Then as we continue through the verses, we read that another kingdom inferior to it arises, this kingdom being represented by the breast and arms of silver. After that came a 3rd kingdom of brass, and so the succession of kingdoms continue, each deteriorating in worth or value. Now why all of this is important is because from this chapter we have established that these 4 kingdoms are successive, one following the other, And secondly, we are told explicitly that the first in this succession was Babylon, after which the rest follows. So returning to Daniel chapter 7, we again see these 4 successive kingdoms, but this time they are represented as beasts. Comparing chapter 7 with chapter 2, the first kingdom represented by the lion would then be a reference to the kingdom of Babylon, coinciding with the head of gold in chapter 2. This representation of Babylon as a lion, or it being likened to an eagle, is also seen elsewhere in scripture. In Jeremiah chapter 50 and verse 17, the Bible says, Israel is a scattered sheep. The lions have driven him away. First the king of Assyria had devoured him, and last this Nebuchadnezzar king of Babylon had broken his bones. The king of Babylon here being likened to a lion. In Jeremiah chapter 4, in reference to Babylon coming to destroy the city of Jerusalem, it reads, The lion is come up from his thicket, and the destroyer of the Gentiles is on his way. He is gone forth from his place to make thy land desolate. And in verse 13 it says, Behold, he shall come up as clouds, and his chariots shall be as a whirlwind. His horses are swifter than eagles. Woe unto us, for we are spoiled. And so having then established that the lion of Daniel 7 represents the kingdom of Babylon, the papacy then having the mouth of a lion means it will have the mouth of the kingdom of Babylon. Now that is very interesting. So what does that mean? Well, with the mouth one speaks, and so the component that the beast of Revelation 13 takes from Babylon is its speech. So that raises the question, how does Babylon speak? Well, Isaiah 47 lets us know. It says, Come down and sit in the dust, O virgin daughter of Babylon. Sit thou silent, O daughter of the Chaldeans, for thou shalt no more be called the lady of the kingdoms. Thou hast said, I shall be a lady forever. Therefore hear now this, thou that art given to pleasures, that dwellest carelessly, that sayest in thine heart, I am, and none else besides me. For thou hast trusted in thy wickedness, thou hast said, None seeth me. And thou hast said in thine heart, I am, and none else beside me. Here we read the words of Babylon. In verse 7 it says, I shall be a lady forever. In verse 8 it says, I am, and there is none else beside me. In verse 10 it trusts in its wickedness and says, None seeth me. And the verse ends with a repetition of the blasphemous words, I am, and there is none beside me. By taking upon itself the name God gave to Moses to express the idea of his eternal presence, we learn of the blasphemous nature of Babylon. It makes itself a god on earth, saying it shall abide forever, and declaring itself to be the great I am. The speaking of a nation can also be seen in the action of its legislative and judicial authorities. Probably one of the more well-known stories in the Bible of Babylon is that of the setting up of the golden image. In Daniel chapter 3, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, made an image of gold in rebellion to the interpretation of the dream that we mentioned earlier. Instead of an image consisting of different metals to denote the succession of kingdoms that would come after him, he made an image entirely of gold, signifying that his kingdom would stand forever. He then issued a decree or a law, compelling everyone to give him homage by worshipping this image made in his honor. From these examples, we now have a clear picture of what the speech of Babylon consists of. It points us to the proud and pompous words of this kingdom, words of blasphemy, and laws that compel the consciences of men to worship an image made in its honor. Therefore, with the papacy having the mouth of Babylon, we should expect to see similar manifestations of these things. Its blasphemous speech we have already seen in our previous video. The Roman pontiff declares himself to be God on earth, and in light of the many abominable crimes of the priests of the Catholic Church, isn't Isaiah 47 a fitting depiction of their sentiment? It says, Therefore hear now this, thou that art given to pleasures, that dwellest carelessly, thou hast trusted in thine wickedness, thou hast said, None seeth me. I think this verse describes their sentiment perfectly. But more than this, the Bible at the end of time speaks of an image being formed, the image of the beast. And we also read of a people being forced or compelled on pain of death to worship this image in Revelation 13. And so at the end of time, we see a repetition of the practices of Babylon by the papacy, a repetition of its speech. And this is what is to be understood by the beast of Revelation 13 having the mouth of the lion. And so continuing on, the kingdom that followed Babylon was likened to a bear. This kingdom also corresponds to the breast and arms of silver in chapter 2 of the book of Daniel. But we read in Daniel chapter 7, "Behold, another beast, a second like to a bear, and it raised up itself on one side, and it had 3 ribs in the mouth of it. And they said thus unto it, Arise, devour much flesh." And so thus is pictured the kingdom after Babylon, a bear that is said to devour much flesh. This would prove to be a fitting description of the bloodthirsty and cruel nature of the Medo-Persian kingdom that followed Babylon. The Medes and the Persians, though being 2 nations, they shared a singular kingdom, the Persian component, however, being the stronger of the 2. This is referenced by the 2 arms of the image in Daniel chapter 2, the fact that the bear was raised to one side in Daniel chapter 7, and it is even explicitly stated in Daniel chapter 8. But the Bible tells us clearly that Babylon was followed by the Medo-Persian kingdom. In Daniel chapter 5 and verse 30 we read, "In that night was Belshazzar the king of the Chaldeans slain, and Darius the Median took the kingdom." The book of Isaiah is even more explicit and vividly portrays the nature of the Medes in their destruction of Babylon. Isaiah chapter 13 reads, "The burden of Babylon, which Isaiah the son of Amos did see. Behold, I will stir up the Medes against them. Their bows also shall dash the young men to pieces, and they shall have no pity on the fruit of the womb. Their eye shall not spare children. And Babylon, the glory of kingdoms, the beauty of the Chaldees' excellency, shall be as when God overthrew Sodom and Gomorrah." And so here we read of the overthrowing of Babylon. But take note of the merciless and cruel depiction of the Medes. It said, "They shall have no pity on the fruit of the womb, and that their eye shall not spare children." This cruelty could also be seen in the time of Esther, when the Persian king was about to destroy all the Jewish people in his domain, both old and young, little children and women, in a single day. And so this is the nature of the Medo-Persian kingdom denoted by this bear. Now the papacy, the beast of Revelation 13, takes its feet from this kingdom. We were told it had the feet of a bear. This would mean that it walks or moves or operates like the Medes and Persians in some way. More than this, in the Bible, feet were used to tread things down, to stamp. And this treading down represented the destruction of one's enemies. The fierce and cruel nature of the Medes and the Persians then gives us an indication of the manner in which the papacy would destroy or persecute the people of God, how it would tread them down. And history has been stained with the blood shed by the Roman Church. The children of the Waldenses, for example, were slaughtered mercilessly. They were thrown in the air and caught with spears, while others had their heads smashed against the rocks. Thousands upon thousands of Protestant Christians were killed during the Dark Ages, and it is fearful to think that the persecutions of the past will be revived. But this cruel and merciless oppression is what is to be understood by the beast of Revelation 13, having the feet of a bear. It would seek to tread the people of God underfoot in a similar fashion to the manner in which the Medes and the Persians destroyed their enemies. And this once again is an incredibly fitting description of how the papal power has sought to oppress or persecute the people of God throughout time. And so there are 2 more things that we would like to address: the body of the leopard and the reception of the beast's power and seat and authority from the dragon. But we will look into the application of those things in our next video. Take care.